Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on 5 o'clock, at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, right during midterms. I really appreciate it. But I think that this will be a great night for everyone. So I want to talk a little tiny bit about our guest, Andi Zeisler, and then turn it over to her. And then I'm going to follow up with some questions and open up the floor for you all. So Andi Zeisler is the co-founder and editorial director of Bitch Media, which is the non-profit organization best known for the magazine Bitch, feminist response to popular culture. We're talking about how Bitch is such a pithy first start, and then it's like feminist response to popular culture, which we have to have, right? Because that's what it's about. And she is also an author, aside from the co-founder of the magazine, of the media company and editorial director. She has co-authored and co-edited Bitch Fest, 10 years of cultural criticism from the pages of Bitch magazine. And also she has authored Feminism and Pop Culture, which she will be signing later on tonight after the talk up in the during the reception. And there is a reception afterwards up in the forum in the, by the humongous media wall. She's now working on a project that she's calling Marketplace Feminism. And I want to just talk a little bit about this as a way to introduce her talk, Don't Just Change the Channel, Why Pop Culture Matters to Feminism, Activism, and Social Justice. Andi and I just happen to be working on a lot of the very, very many similar issues. We've been talking today about how we should just, co-author the damn thing rather than she write a book and I write a book. We're talking, and what we're talking about is what we're trying to think through, and what Andi's trying to think through in this new book, Marketplace Feminism, is what does it mean that feminism is all around us? Right? Feminism is certainly something that we're talking about more and more in popular media. It circulates over multiple media platforms. It has different iterations, right? It comes, we see it with Beyonce. We see it with princess feminism. We see it with grunge feminism. We see it with hashtag activism, such as Solidarity is for White Women, Bring Back Our Girls. We see it on Etsy, where you can buy all sorts of, feminist outfits, like this is what a feminist looks like, or an embroidery that says smash the patriarchy, or, all sorts of different kinds of things, crafts that we see that mention the word feminism. For lots of you who are of a different generation, this, probably doesn't seem so surprising. For me, it's pretty shocking to have the word feminism, the idea that you can be a feminist, the idea that is not the F word so much anymore, something that people say, I'm not a feminist, but, and then have a list of different reasons why they're not a feminist. It's really shocking that we see it so often circulating in the media, and it's really a moment to kind of celebrate. And it's a moment that is quite interesting. However, there's a whole other side to it that Andi is going to talk about tonight, which is also about what it means that it's this sort of popular feminism is situated in a marketplace. What does it mean if feminism is a brand? What does it mean if we can wear our feminism, right? Or is that all we have to do? Just wear it. Just wear a shirt that says this is what a feminist looks like, and then go on our merry way. So these are the kinds of issues that Andi is exploring in her new book. They are the kinds of issues that Bitch magazine explores, in each issue. If you don't know Bitch Media or you don't know Bitch magazine, please get familiar with it. It's a really innovative and really interesting magazine. And it's one of the few magazines out there that is specifically dedicated to feminism and popular culture. There are other feminist magazines. There are other magazines on popular culture. But this Bitch is really something that intersects these together and offers a new and interesting story with every issue. So without further ado, Andi Zeisler.
Thank you so much for being here. So I'm actually not going to talk that much about marketplace feminism in this talk. I think we'll probably talk about it a little more afterward. This really is more about, kind of a little bit about the history of bitch and why we do what we do, and popular culture as kind of a locus of feminist activism. So yeah. How many of you are familiar with Bitch, either the magazine or the website or... Okay, that's good. That's yay. Thanks. So we started as a zine in 1996. There were three of us who were high school friends, Lisa Jervis and Benjamin Shaken and myself. And we really wanted to do something useful with all the time we spent consuming popular culture, reading magazines and watching TV and seeing movies. And sort of complaining amongst ourselves about how insulting and hackneyed the portrayals of not just women and girls, but gender in general, sort of male-female stereotypes, race and class stereotypes, all those things. I always say that we were sort of frustrated readers as much as we were writers. We gladly would have, read anything and everything on the subject, but at the time, pre-internet, pre-blogs, pre-social media, there wasn't a lot out there. The word post-feminist was being thrown around a lot in, scholarly type books, but that seemed to us to be very premature, given the pop culture climate. From our perspective, pop culture was moving backward instead of forward in how it represented and stereotyped women and men and gender in general. And so we started Bitch with the mission to sort of encourage an engaged, thoughtful feminist response to mainstream media and popular culture. So this is what the magazine looks like these days. It's a quarterly magazine, and then we have a website that's updated daily. We have a bi-monthly podcast called Propaganda, and we have a campus program called Bitch on Campus, where we work with professors and students to bring materials and speakers from Bitch to various campuses. A big thing we talked a lot about at the time we started Bitch was really changing the way people thought about activism. This was in the mid-1990s, and to a lot of people, feminism was something that had happened. It had involved women marching in the streets and protesting Miss America and burning their bras and all that, even though the bra part never happened. And when people talked about feminism, it was as though they were talking about this kind of historical moment that had come and gone. And that was it was not fashionable. It had been done. I heard many friends and contemporaries in college say things like, well, I believe in equal rights, but I would never march about it. So that, to me, I found a little bit frustrating. Some of the first actions that brought national notice to the women's movement in the late 1960s and 70s were based around media and pop culture. There was a protest of the Miss America pageant in 1968 in Atlantic City. The first class action sex discrimination suit was filed against Newsweek in 1970, and there was a sit-in at Ladies' Home Journal that same year. And there was a coalition of activists called Women Against Pornography who organized guided tours of New York's Times Square in the late 1970s and 80s, where they would, visit shops and theaters and talk with performers in the industry to sort of find out what was going on there and why it was a feminist issue. Before I go any further, I'm going to interrupt myself and talk about the word bitch and why we chose it as a title, because I found in doing these talks that some people need to know the answer to that, so much so that they can't concentrate on anything else until they find out the answer. So I'm just going to cut to the chase. Yes, we chose the name bitch for a number of reasons. We really wanted a name that sort of stood out from other feminist magazines on the newsstand, which were sort of immediately identifiable as feminist, whether because of their name or their aesthetics or a combination of the two. We wanted people to have to come a little closer, pick up the magazine, see what it was all about. Second reason, we were really interested in the idea, the dual nature of the title, the fact that, bitch was a noun and a verb. It seemed really important at the time that we talk about that, and that we talk about the sort of active verb form of bitching as a form of activism. And then the third reason was the possible reclamation of the word bitch as something that, could serve powerful women who were tired of having their independence and their staunchness reduced to this epithet. In 1996, bitch was still very much considered a naughty word. It was one of the 7 words you couldn't say on TV or on radio, and we felt really strongly that if we were going to do something that people would normally term something that bitches did, stand up for ourselves, talk about gender inequality, we might as well, sort of go the whole 9 and reclaim the word before people could use it against us. So the 3 of us grew up in New York City, and we were really inspired by activist groups in the 1980s like ACT UP, who, among other things, helped reclaim the word queer for LGBTQ populations with their work around AIDS awareness and activism. I don't necessarily think the reclamation of the word bitch has been as successful as the reclamation of queer, but my experience over the past almost 20 years of doing this has been that having the word feminist in the magazine's subtitle has been far more controversial than having the word bitch as a title. And that's because the word bitch has, for better or worse, become part of our cultural lexicon. Most of you probably grew up with it, hearing it on the radio and on TV and in movies constantly. And yet feminist is still one of those words that people find very, very difficult to understand, or they need so much more information to contextualize it. And so a lot of people, without looking at the magazine, assume, because of the combination of those 2 words, so much about it. That it's about man bashing, or that it's, very aggressive, neither of which is true. But it really underscores the fact that feminism still has a real image problem, and people who aren't necessarily, conversant in its history often experience it as a personal attack. And so we've always understood that both the name and the content are not necessarily an easy sell, and that it won't please anyone. And so starting from that point was actually kind of freeing to think like, well, we can call this magazine bitch, and we may have to do some explaining, but we're also asking people to open their minds about it. So it's important. I'm going to, this presentation is basically a list of reasons why it's important to pay attention to popular culture, and that's shorthanded as don't change the channel. And the first is that media and pop culture are inescapable. Across American culture as a whole, how we talk about gender and power and representation is ever more entwined with how we consume pop cultural products. We see the same narratives spun out in music videos, in advice books, on the covers of prominent magazines, and in countless advertisements. And, some of those narratives are, women want love while men want sex, or careers and motherhood are incompatible, or, strong black women are the only kind of woman you want to be. Pop culture and media, they're incredibly central in how we form our impressions about the world and our beliefs about who we are and who we want to be. And so it's really crucial to take pop culture seriously for that reason, and not think of it as something that's separate from real life, and instead think of it as something that both informs and reflects real life. So something we've always said is, don't hate media, make media. because that really underscores the importance of taking it seriously and paying attention to what stories it tells us. When Lisa and Ben and I started Bitch, we ran into a lot of opinion, and frankly still do, that was along the lines of, it's just pop culture, it's just entertainment, you're not supposed to take it seriously. Or, you know, if you don't like what's on TV, you can just change the channel. Why are you making such a big deal about this show or that movie? And what we've always said is that's not the point. It doesn't matter whether we consume it. It matters the fact that it's out in the world, doing its job, spreading its messages, that matters. And as time has gone on, it's become, I think, increasingly clear that you can't escape popular culture and media, and that's because our lives themselves have become so mediated. So these are just a few statistics from the Media Education Foundation. By age 18, a teenager will have seen more than 400,000 TV commercials. More than $2 billion is spent annually to target juvenile consumers. The average American child will see more than 200,000 acts of violence on television by age 18. There are a lot of statistics like these. And in addition, about 10 years ago, there was a report released by the American Psychological Association's Task Force on the Sexualization of Girls. And that was the first time such a report had been released. And what it found was not only that sexualization of girls starts when they're as young as 2, with things like, you know, diapers that are branded girls' diapers and not boys' diapers, whatever that is. But also that these images of girls and young women in advertising and in media is doing demonstrable harm to girls' self-image and their development. The report looked at the consequences, both mental and emotional, of early sexualization, and it found that, you know, no matter what they learned at home or at school or at, you know, church or wherever, media and pop culture, the messages they got there about women as passive, sexualized objects of desire were the ones that most resonated. So the second reason not to change the channel is that the stories media and pop culture tell are the ones we believe. So I first learned about the concept of media literacy when I was in college, and it was, you know, it was a real truth bomb. I started realizing just how much I and the people around me used popular culture somewhat inadvertently to define who we were, who we wanted to become, who we wanted to meet. From, you know, the music we listened to our favorite movies and books, to what sporting events we followed, pop culture really told the world who we were and told ourselves who we were. And this was also the time when it first occurred to me that the people who create the pop culture or created the pop culture, you know, that I simultaneously loved and hated, were not these pure, perfect, omniscient beings. They were people with biases and imperfections and agendas who were putting forth their own views of the world in the media they created. So it's a good thing that Graydon Carter left, because this was one of the pop culture moments that really catalyzed Bitch as a zine way back in 1995. It sounds very dramatic, but I really remember being stopped in my tracks by this cover when I saw it, you know, at the Safeway in Oakland, California, because my first thought was that it summed up so well a lot of what my co-founders and I had been discussing amongst ourselves about media narratives standing in for, you know, sort of real conversations about gender and progress. You know, we talk about pictures telling a story and pictures having narratives. And the story, you know, we as a culture believe that this cover sort of supports is that women are most valuable as beautiful things and as sexual beings. It's a story that says the only way to be beautiful is to be thin and blonde and white. It says that the only way you're worth anything is if you're, you know, in your underwear. And that is a story that has, you know, it's told countless ways in media and popular culture, and it's a very limited story. And it often takes looking at other sides of the story to understand why it matters. So this was the next year's Vanity Fair cover. And so you see that this is a very, very different story. And a lot of people would say, well, why does it matter? And I would say it matters because we're telling girls and we're telling women that they are held to an increasingly weird and a definitely different set of standards than their male counterparts. And there are layers and levels and sub-narratives. And so one of the sub-narratives that we see a lot as women is that, we're simply a collection of body parts, and, they're interchangeably used and they're divorced from humanity. We're told that there's a sub-narrative of women as, very little of what you do matters unless you are preserving your adherence to a status quo concept of beauty and desirability. There's a sub-narrative of women as sexual prizes for good consumers. If you buy this sandwich or that car or the American Apparel hoodie, you'll be at the epicenter of your own erotic, earthquake. And, there are more menacing, pernicious sub-narratives, like violence against women is incredibly sexy, which is a sub-narrative that is really only used to sell high fashion. You're not going to see a dead woman in a trunk advertising yogurt. It's inextricably linked to this idea of luxury and excess. And limited narratives are also part of the editorial media status quo. Hillary Clinton is pictured as a kind of Godzilla-like monster crushing men under, the sole of her sensible heeled pump. It's like she's a terrible epidemic rather than a viable presidential candidate. Jill Abramson, the New York Times editor who was very publicly fired last year, was described in the ensuing media coverage as pushy, as though, that's a legitimate reason to fire her. It also framed her anger as irrational, as though, taking this completely out of context photo of her at the boxing gym, as though she was going to go, punching her way into the New York Times building. So these are very insidious ways that mainstream media frames its coverage of women. Consider the way that bias comes through in the use of scare quotes, which are often used to sort of call into question the veracity of rape accusations. By putting quotes around the word rape in headlines, the framing is saying essentially, we don't believe this is rape, and we're asking you to doubt it as well. These things are all part of, these all construct a biased narrative that we come to see as immutable and as true. The third reason not to change the channel, and that's in media and pop culture, 2 steps forward often means 1 step back. I tend to feel that a big part of what a lot of people misunderstand about feminism is that it's still very relevant, despite the fact that some of what earlier feminists fought for quite publicly has come to pass. There's this idea that because some women gained some ground in some areas, feminism happened and we're all done. And that's absolutely not true. The word post-feminist was starting to be used around the time we started Bitch. And in academic spheres, the post in post-feminism, translated as beyond, as in feminism happened and post-feminism is what happens next to build on the foundation of what feminism did. But mainstream culture embraced post-feminism as meaning against feminism, as in feminism worked and now we can all go back to embracing the fun and joy in sexism and traditional femininity that those mean feminists had taken away. So just as one example, we began to see a lot of advertising that proceeded from a place of basically saying, this would be totally sexist if we didn't know better, but we know better. So this is a tongue-in-cheek reference that actually empowers women. Another key theme in the media version of post-feminism was that feminism had actually worked so well that it had damaged women who were now overworked, unhappy, unloved, child-starved, and too scared to admit that what they really wanted was a traditional life of weddings and husbands and children. This is a still from Friends. I don't know if you... Okay. I don't know. I don't know what the kids are watching these days. So as the media pushed a version of post-feminism, real life for many women has backslid into a deeply anti-feminist place. You know, we are far from living in a post-feminist world as defined by the mainstream media. Again, we live in a world where because some women have gained some ground in many areas, there's this idea that we're all, you know, really sitting pretty. But that minimum of progress produced a disproportionate amount of fear that women's rights and achievements are some kind of threat to the so-called natural order. And so it's in this climate that, for instance, abortion restrictions have skyrocketed on a state-by-state level in just the past decade. It's in this climate that politicians and pundits feel free to say incredibly hateful things about women who admit publicly to, for instance, wanting contraception to be covered by insurance just as Viagra is for men. It's in this climate that even as there are more female senators and CEOs than ever before, in many, many cases, they are paid less money for doing the exact same work as their male counterparts. You know, only months ago, every Republican in the Senate voted against the Paycheck Fairness Act, a bill meant to close the pay gap between men and women doing the same work. Media and pop culture are also a little confusing in this supposedly post-feminist world. You know, I watch The Bachelor, I live tweet it, but if feminism has truly served its purpose, then why is it one of the highest rated offerings on television, something that really does depict single women as these kind of crazed, tunnel vision husband hunters? If we live in a post-feminist world, why do tabloid magazines care whether Jennifer Aniston ever gets a child in her, you know, lonely old uterus? Why do we care who has the best beach body? On the upside, opportunities to make media and pop culture reflect a better, more diverse world are all around us. And, you know, evidence of the small steps forward are all around us and are often really exciting. More female characters, showrunners, writers, and producers have indeed led to a more diverse, more representative landscape of female characters and perspectives. There are some really gratifying themes in today's pop culture when it comes to representation. You know, there are more women, there are more people of color, there are more transgender characters, there are more diverse and complex and multifaceted male characters, women characters, characters of self-defined gender. Watchdog organizations are making inequality increasingly obvious and amplifying it. And blogging and social media are disseminating the findings of these organizations to wider and wider audiences, thanks in part to social media. And the internet and all its wonderful fruit has changed both the number and the demographics of voices being amplified. New technologies have made authorship and criticism a lot more broad categories than they used to be, have made it possible for even one or two voices to spearhead actual change. Consider the recent revelations about Bill Cosby as a serial rapist. Bill Cosby's history of drugging and sexual assault was kind of an open secret within the traditional spheres of white male journalism and comedy historians and biographers. But it was one offhand reference by Hannibal Buress, a stand-up comedian, that exploded into the first instance of substantive consequences against Bill Cosby. And, you know, it might be a perfect storm of it being the right time. You know, the White House suddenly cares about sexual assault on campus. There's a lot more activism around Title IX and the awareness of students to know their rights when it comes to sexual assault on campus. It might be the right atmosphere, but I also think it's a combination of, you know, the right place at the right time and the right voices and the right audiences. I talked earlier about the importance of demystifying activism and how that was a real driver of what we wanted to do with Bitch. And, you know, I think one of the most important things that the internet and new technologies have done really is making activism not only more accessible, but sort of less of a burden, I guess. You no longer have to define yourself as an activist to do activism in a consistent and meaningful way. Collective action and policy reform will always be important, but we're also in a place where, again, one or two people can make significant changes with, you know, a well-placed meme or a Tumblr post. In 2012, the Breast Cancer Foundation, Susan G. Komen for the Cure, announced that it would no longer be funding cancer detection screenings at Planned Parenthood because of Planned Parenthood's abortion services. Users on Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr responded immediately with posts and satire and support for Planned Parenthood, as well as jabs at the hypocrisy of the Komen Foundation. You know, in the space of a couple of days, Planned Parenthood received donations and pledges that totaled more than 5 times the amount that they stood to lose. And that's really important. Again, this is not a huge lobbying organization exerting pressure that the Susan G. Komen Foundation has to listen to. This is millions and millions of everyday users who are enacting activism in a way that gets it across to millions more people than it would have reached otherwise. So within 3 days, the pressure and the media spotlight on Komen was so intense and so unflattering that the foundation reversed its decision. But it's now being used in PR classes as an example of how not to do things like this because the damage to the brand was so extensive. Another example, in 2010, a colleague of mine who used to blog at the women's site The Frisky posted about a collaboration between MAC Cosmetics and the fashion label Rodarte. And the label's collection was inspired by the city of Juarez in Mexico, which probably many of you know is a terrifying place to live if you're a woman. More than 370 young women, most of them factory workers, have been murdered there since 1993 with notorious inaction on the part of the area's law enforcement. And so, you know, the fashion and beauty industries aren't known for their, you know, they're not really known for being political or, you know, sensitive or subtle or self-reflective. So it's very notable that when the Frisky and other beauty blogs began speaking out against both companies, it really got noticed. Other blogs picked up the story, the fashion press picked it up, mainstream newspapers picked it up. And within a fairly short time, MAC announced that they were not going to ship the collection and were going to donate money to an unspecified aid charity in Juarez. So again, what's remarkable about this example is that it demonstrates that just a handful of people literally bitching, speaking up, and others supporting that can lead to tangible victory and change actual products that enter the real life marketplace. Talking back can be a whole lot of fun, and this is something that we always suspected when we first started Bitch, but which has just really become clear as time goes on. We were inspired by a variety of activism. This is a famous photo that was taken in 1979 of a Fiat billboard in the UK, and we were inspired growing up by the work of the Guerrilla Girls, art world activists who started out talking about the sexism within the fine art institutions of New York City, but now do a lot of work around Hollywood sexism. You may have seen their billboards in Hollywood around the makeup of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. I mentioned ACT UP earlier. It was a political action collective formed to draw attention to the AIDS crisis and the government's inaction on it. And Keith Haring was one of the main artists who did their posters. And, you know, it was very clear, very simple, and very effective. So we always knew that we wanted Bitch to be an activist publication that was as visual and fun as it was analytical. So that was absolutely a focus from the start. The Hawkeye Initiative is a great example of making activism both visual and fun. This is in the realm of comic books, which are sort of notorious for having a very pronounced difference between the way male and female characters are drawn. And so this Tumblr user had this idea to fix the way women were drawn in comics, and it was to have the character Hawkeye from the Avengers mimic their poses. The official mission of the site is to draw attention to how deformed, hypersexualized, and unrealistically dressed women are drawn in comics. And it's an example of how you, again, as with the Vanity Fair thing, you often don't understand or really see the depth of inequity until the script is kind of flipped. And a lot of artists have really taken this idea and run with it. And it's effective. Okay, some of you are already familiar with this. Humor itself can often be its own kind of activism, as we all know from, you know, things like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and John Oliver's show. The Bic for Her pen launched in 2012 and, you know, promptly became the laughingstock of the pen world because of Amazon users who really took the concept of a pen for women and ran with it. And if you ever have, like, I don't know, if you're ever procrastinating, there's like 400 of these and they're all brilliant. That said, the line between activism and co-optation is thin. And the past 6 months or so have been a really fascinating case study in what happens when feminism goes mainstream. Shortly after Beyonce closed out the MTV Video Music Awards with this public declaration, Emma Watson gave a speech on the importance of gender equality to the United Nations. Taylor Swift, who several years earlier had disavowed feminism, quickly changed tack with her own media announcement that, in fact, she was feminist all along. At Paris Fashion Week, Chanel's runway show finale took the form of a feminist rally with models in the labels tweeds, raising signs that read, "History is her story," and "Women's rights are more than all right." And brands like Verizon are centering feminist themes in their ads for wireless plans. My own Google alert, which used to turn up, you know, sort of the occasional article with a title like "Feminism, Outmoded and Unpopular," is now like brimming with woman power boosterism. Beyonce's hip new club, feminism. Emma Watson gives feminism new life. Why male feminists are hot. That's Chanel. Yeah, it's happening. That's Always, which you might have seen during the Super Bowl, their Like a Girl campaign. But despite every signal boost for feminism and every sort of feel-good meme and upworthy video and every nod to leaning in, the beliefs behind feminism remain among the most contested in political and social life. And the question at the heart of every wave so far of feminism has always been, are women human beings with the same rights and liberties as men? And that question, despite everything that's going on with feminism being a hip new club, is contested every day in politics, in entertainment, in the workplace, in court, in academia. Every state restriction on abortion and contraception, every rape case where the victim is considered imperfect, every incident like the mass shooting last year at UC Santa Barbara, every death threat aimed at women who speak out about the gender terrorism they experience online. The aspects of feminism that are currently, sort of most amplified in media and pop culture are the friendliest and sexiest ones, the ones that for the most part center on heterosexual relationships between white people and marriage, on economic success that doesn't challenge, existing capitalist structures, on the right to be desirable yet have bodily autonomy, and most importantly, on selling things. Emma Watson's speech to the UN centered on getting men invested in feminism in order to better legitimize it. Sheryl Sandberg's lean-in philosophy is about women conforming to workplaces that increasingly see all their workers, not just women, as automatons, and women as automatons with very inconvenient biology. So popular feminism doesn't necessarily challenge identities so much as it offers sort of nips and tucks to a largely unfeminist status quo. So it's really important that people invested in feminism use its current popularity as a means to an end and not the end itself. So mainstream acceptance and trendiness can and will change. I mean, that's sort of the thing about trends. So it's not uncool to care. I speak a lot at colleges and universities, and one of the things I've heard from people is that they often want to speak up. They want to call out things like sexism or racism in their campus newspapers, for instance, or they want to make their voices heard in the larger world on these issues, but they also feel weird about it. Like it's just not cool within their social group or on their campus to be seen as an activist, and they worry that they'll be labeled as politically correct or that people just won't see them as fun anymore. And among feminism's countless legendarily bad associations is the idea that it's simply too earnest. And, again, like I mentioned before, we constantly have people saying to us at Bitch, lighten up, it's just entertainment, not everything has to be analyzed. What happened here? Sorry, my computer is freezing. Oh, so part of the mainstream media's invention of post-feminism was kind of the devaluation of both analysis and empathy. The idea was that, as long as you have an umbrella, it's not raining. Phrases that became popular around during the same time that post-feminism took hold were things like bleeding heart liberal and politically correct and thought police. And the inference there was that caring was some kind of weakness. And then these days, we're seeing kind of a resurgence of that. There are a lot of hand-wringing articles and think pieces about a so-called resurgence of political correctness that is somehow stifling controversial thought. So there's this, there was a Newsweek cover story in 1990, and it was basically reiterated in this very recent New York Magazine article that I mistakenly captioned with 2014 instead of 2015 because I am an idiot, apparently. Sorry about that. It's 2015. So, and the people who invariably write these kinds of articles are almost always white, almost always privileged, and invariably male. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. And I think that what they're seeing is not a result of people suddenly becoming more sensitive or prone to outrage or overly politically correct. It's a result of people who were formerly marginalized by the media finally being heard, being listened to, And it's a reaction to that democratization of access that I mentioned before. It's incredibly important. You know, the media gatekeepers of the past are still very much in place in many media spheres, but there's a constant challenge to their primacy now, especially in the realm of social media, and that does freak them out. But we founded Bitch on the principle that if nobody speaks up, nothing is going to change. And again, in an increasingly mediated world, that is truer than ever. Which is not to say that you have to come out of the gate a full-blown activist. You can really start small. You can start anonymously. You can start in absolutely micro ways. One of my favorite sort of recent activist projects is the Everyday Sexism Project, which is basically a virtual version of what second wave feminists called consciousness raising, where it's just that belief that by sharing incidents that you've been led to believe are individualistic, you realize that they're not, they're systemic, you know? So as many times as you've heard, well, you wouldn't have gotten that comment if you hadn't been wearing that skirt, or you wouldn't have been in that domestic, you know, a domestically abusive relationship if you weren't picking the wrong people. It's really a case of people realizing that there are systems of inequity and there are intersections of inequity, and they matter. And people shouldn't be told that it's just their problem when in fact it's not. So that's one. There's, you know, the possibility for anonymity and a kind of guerrilla aspect to activism is really important. There's an artist named Tatiana Fazlalizadeh, who is doing an ongoing media project to combat street harassment in both the United States and Mexico. And that involves basically drawing portraits of women, giving voice to their stories, and wheat pasting them everywhere. This is a very, very classic form of activism, and yet it's still one of the most useful ones. And then you can also simply start thinking more critically about the media that you're already consuming. And when you start doing that, when you start thinking about media and pop culture as more than just entertainment, more than just information, it can be really scary because you're admitting to its power. I deeply love pop culture and media in general, you know, despite its many flaws. Getting to see Graydon Carter was amazing because Spy magazine was my favorite magazine in high school. And anytime you see like a snarky infographic or something like that, that's because of Spy. I know that all these aspects of pop culture, probably more than my upbringing or my family or my formal education, have really shaped my sense of self and my views on the world. And actually stopping to think about that is kind of terrifying. Just a few more statistics specifically about female representation. My co-founders and I saw Bitch from the outset as part of this larger movement toward media literacy and media criticism and making media and the means of production transparent. We knew that a big part of the audience we might find was likely to be a young audience, and part of the message we wanted to impart is that it's not only not frivolous to look closely and care about pop culture and question the messages of what people consider, you know, sort of lightweight mediums like television and Hollywood films and teen magazines. It's crucial. You know, it is really key to look at how mainstream media creates narratives around feminism, around gender, around sexuality, around work-family balance, around race, around relationships, all of these things, and to point out what's not there, what's missing, what's marginalized, what is completely overlooked or twisted. So the final sort of takeaway from that is, you know, if you love and value media and popular culture, work to make it better. It's very, very easy. So, you know, one of the things we talked about a lot when we started Bitch in our kind of very, very idealistic brainstorming phase was if TV producers and movie directors and ad gurus and the people who actually create the media and pop culture around us are thinking critically about media every day and are willing to put progressive, feminist, controversial, interesting content into the world rather than relying on the same old formulas that have existed for years, that could conceivably change the way people think about gender, about feminism, about the value of women in our culture. We take so many of our ideas, again, and our sense of identity, often unconsciously, from media. So a sea change within it, it doesn't have to hurt, and it could have really incredible effects. There's this famous quote by the artist Robert Rauschenberg. I really feel sorry for people who think things like soap dishes or mirrors or Coke bottles are ugly because they're surrounded by things like that all day long and it must make them miserable. And that's kind of how I feel about mass media, about TV and advertising and popular culture. We are immersed in these things and it's unlikely to change, so the best thing we can do is try to make them better. And these days, it's easier than ever. Not only can you sort of reach out to the people you admire and the creators you admire, places like Twitter, it's easier than ever to make your own media. As Bob Iger said before in his talk with Graydon Carter, the means of production are more accessible than they've ever been before. And all of that is part of making media more interesting, less stereotypical, more diverse, less damaging, and more reflective of the real world we live in. And just over the past 20 years, I've seen a lot of change, and that's incredibly heartening because I know in the next 20 years there's going to be even more. And I hope that people, who are invested in that culture don't get put off and don't get too daunted by the fact that it really is this sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back dynamic, because change will continue to happen in part not from the top, but from the people who are the fans and the consumers. And I'm hoping that some of you are among them. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for that. That was great. So we have, I don't have a clock. What's our time? It's 6? Okay, so we have a little bit of time for questions. And I think I'm going to start off just to get the conversation going. I have 2 general questions that I thought maybe we could have a dialogue about. One is, I really appreciate your laying out what you would call basically a love-hate relationship with popular culture and with images of gender and images, in the media and that sort of thing. But I think that we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think that in the U.S., it's very hard for us to understand what a love-hate relationship actually means. We want it to be either love or hate. That's so much easier. It's so much easier to be certain about something and to say, I just hate this or I love this. But to say love, hate means you're sort of wishy-washy. It means you can't make up your mind. It means, that somehow you're not certain about this position. And I actually think that one of the things that we need to embrace with multimedia platforms that we have now in a digital era is that sort of ambivalence, that sort of love-hate relationship that we all have with, most of us have with the media. And so I was, thinking about this in terms of the question du jour for celebrities now, which is, are you a feminist? And then for some reason that becomes a news story, whether or not they say yes or no, and why they say yes and why they say no. And if it's, like you said, if it's like a hot guy who says, I'm a feminist, he gets a lot more attention because, after all, he's hot and he's a guy and he's a feminist, right? So that is, I think, playing into this either or, sort of ideology. And I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, I mean, we're not really a culture that's known for nuance, particularly mainstream media. There's this real sense. What does that mean? I don't know. Anyway, there's this real sense that you have to have an answer. It has to be suitably soundbitey. And it will be crafted for maximum clickbait. So even if a young starlet says, yes, I'm a feminist, I wasn't always, I used to think that feminists were all man-haters. The man-haters part is the one that's going to be pulled out and teased as a headline. So I think there really is this, first of all, there's, the capitalist imperative to get clicks and move units and all that. And then secondly, there is this distrust of nuance and gray area. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things I would love for people, on the one hand, I really enjoy on some level that the question is even being asked, that it's become this kind of de rigueur question. But on the other hand, I often feel like we ask too much of celebrities in general in terms of sort of steering our conversations. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to us. We should just stop asking that question, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's one of those kind of, this is a hard beast to rein in.
Yeah.
Popular culture and gender and feminism. And I think that it's, because there are so many different iterations and variations. And so I think that asking that question is, again, it's forcing us into a position where it's just enough to say yes or no, rather than what does it mean to you to be a feminist? I mean, there's never like a follow-up question to that. And, what is, how do you practice your feminism, Taylor? I'm sure Taylor does, because now she is the ambassador to New York. So she is, I'm sure she does. But there's just sort of, we don't finish the question. I think the always thing and the empowerment stuff that we see all over the place, the Dove ads, you guys have seen the always, that was on the Super Bowl, Verizon did a STEM thing, and I think that there's a general circulation of this idea of empowerment for girls, but there's never a finishing of that question either. Well, what are we empowering them to do?
My pet peeve is when people say, what does feminism mean to you? Or like, how do you define, no, it's not what does feminism mean to you, it's how do you define feminism? Because feminism has a definition, it doesn't need you to define it. Elle UK recently did a feminism issue with Emma Watson on the cover, and on the contributors page, they asked all the contributors, what's your definition of feminism? And there's a British feminist named Caitlin Moran who's, she's somewhat controversial, she's said a lot of weird things about race. She's not my favorite, but she's very much like sort of the Lena Dunham of the UK. She's kind of their current figurehead of feminism. And her husband is a music writer, and he wrote an article about feminism for that issue. And they asked him, how do you define feminism? And his answer, literally, his answer was good manners. That's literally the opposite of what feminism is, if you think about it. Yeah. And it's sort of like, this is the problem. Like, you don't get to make up your own definitions. Like, it's a word, it has a definition. I think, when people say, what does feminism mean to you, that does let people get at a little more of the nuance, their own personal experience of maybe coming to feminism or initially rejecting it and then embracing it. But asking people to define it, I have kind of an issue with that.
Well, I think it's also the individual question. Are you a feminist or are you not? And what does it mean to you? As if there's like an unlimited number of definitions.
Right.
And that is actually very controversial to argue against that, because, people, get very upset if you can't have your own individual opinion about it. But I think asking, what does feminist practice look like?
Yeah.
Where is feminism being practiced? How is there a practice, feminist praxis in and within on the media is a different sort of question.
Well, what I would like to see too, particularly with these young sort of actresses, because really it usually is only women who are asked. The men are usually only asked if they've previously made some sort of statement or done some work for a cause. But for instance, Emma Watson, who was voted by Ms. and Cosmopolitan the top celebrity feminist, because that's the thing we're doing now, it was recently announced that she's going to star in a live action adaptation of Beauty and the Beast, which is one of those fairy tales that feminists have had a field day with over the years, because it's essentially about an abusive relationship. So it would be interesting to me if people said, Emma Watson, you're a self-professed feminist. How do you square that? Like, how are you going to bring that that praxis or even that awareness to a role as, Disney's most famous domestic abuse victim. That would be interesting to me, but that would never happen.
Right, right.
So,
One more question, and maybe this could be a way to open it up too. One of the things that you showed in this talk are different ways in which there's been a backlash against feminism, especially contemporary feminism and popular feminism. And I think that whenever we are in a moment where feminism, the word feminism or the concept is circulating even in problematic ways, but it's circulating in more than it has, ever because of just the ubiquity of social media, of multimedia platforms and everything else. What is also ratcheted up is a misogynistic reaction to it. There's a lot of, threat that is felt when something like feminism becomes mainstream. So you have, the increase and the increased visibility of men's rights organization, activism, which have been around since the 70s, but no one really paid much attention to them.
Right.
Now they're really making a lot of noise on social media and so on. But there's also been this general understanding of a general idea of rape culture, where you put up some of the stuff, but that rape culture is something that looks quite different, really, than it did in other eras. You have rape threats and death threats to women, like you said, on social media, that are horrific, and so it seems like the vitriol of what I would consider popular misogyny is much more intense than it has been in the past.
Yeah, and that's partly because the tools are there. We didn't hear much from the men's rights people in the late 1970s and early 1980s because they were in the woods with Robert Bly beating drums, and that was cool, and they were happy, and we were happy. I mean, I wasn't. I was like 5, but we have all these tools to make ourselves heard and to define ourselves in opposition to other people. And feminism has always been a threat, I think, out of proportion to what it's actually doing. Like Bell Hooks said, feminism is for everyone. And that's always been the case. I mean, if you just, I consider like Free to Be You and Me a really formative feminist text because what it's really saying is if you liberate everyone from gender roles, we're all freer, And there's a ton of work being done, by men, by people of non-normative gender and sexuality presentations that really underscore the fact that liberation is not just about women, it's about everyone being able to define themselves away from, the very boxed in, constricted ways they've been socialized into ideas of masculinity and femininity, which have done extensive damage to, a lot of people. But I do think that there is this sense that it's a zero-sum game, that if feminists get what they want, it's going to involve taking something away from everyone else. And I don't, I think it would be hard to say whether or not that's happened on a sort of mass cultural level. I know that there are there's this new show called The Slap, and in the premiere, the protagonist learns that he's lost a promotion. But he hasn't just lost a promotion, he's lost it to a woman. You know what I mean? And that's sort of supposed to represent this huge feeling of failure to him. So I think we get like sort of little bits of that sprinkled throughout pop culture that really drive this sense that it is this movement to not liberate men but to hurt men.
But to threaten.
And that you can't liberate women without, doing damage to men. And I think that is a very, very pervasive idea that it's going to take, I don't know if it's possible to disabuse people of that notion. I mean, I hope so, but yeah.
Well, on that, I want to open it up to questions. So Tony's here and Brianna's here. Yeah.
Hi. So in this capitalist society we have producers and consumers, and we were learning in our class earlier last week about how like feminism has become in pop culture, as in your presentation, a very sellable item, a commodity. And I mean, I used to be the same person who was like, oh my God, feminist. I was afraid of the word, didn't want to associate myself with the word. And through Tumblr and various other users online, that's how I became aware of it and more knowledgeable and socially conscious of it. Not so much through popular culture, whereas now I like look at it and I notice it's literally everywhere. Same with like football, like the Super Bowl ads and everything. So my question was, well, basically we learned in class is that, is it so much in pop culture, or is it so much part of a pop culture now because it's so sellable? And because we talked about how like the main target audience was young girls, and so is it this popular now because it's so sellable of an item, whereas like in a couple years from now, when it stops being so new or trendy or whatever, it's just going to go away? And how we kind of talked about this idea of how like the industries are just feeding this to us as consumers to take, oh, this idea of feminism. So do you think it's going to fade in a couple of years when it stops trending, or do you think that these effects are going to be lasting and eventually impact society?
Well, I mean, from the moment that feminism became sort of a visible movement, it was co-opted by people who wanted to use it to sell things. You know, Virginia Slims was created essentially to convince women that having the right to kill themselves with tobacco was something they should be really psyched about. There was, you know, something called a liberated wool sweater that was marketed to women at the start, you know, of the women's movement. This has always been the case. I don't think that's going to change. I mean, I think what's happening now and why it matters is that, again, like, our culture itself is so increasingly mediated that we don't really get a choice whether or not to be immersed in it. Just the channels and the ways in which we are sort of fed advertising and new products and things like that, just, I mean, exponentially bigger than it was during the second wave of feminism. So yeah, that definitely matters. I mean, it's one of those things that I think feminism is considered a much more sellable sort of political identity than something like, I don't know, prison reform or socialism, because it is tied to the idea of liberation. And whenever liberation's involved, there's this idea that, you know, we can sell you things to really facilitate this feeling that liberation matters. I think the way that the discourse has progressed, especially with words like choice and empowerment, those have really been crucial to constructing feminism as like a consumer identity. And the replacement of the word, the subbing in of the word choice for rights, which originally was a factor in the legal decision in Roe v. Wade. You know, it was very explicitly framed as a choice rather than as a right. It's a way to soften things, and it's a way to say, like, we're making you believe that this thing that you have a human right to do is instead a choice, and really putting it in the language of a marketplace. And so, yeah, I mean, that has really escalated over just the past couple of decades. And there really is this belief now that, you know, feminism can be an identity that is decontextualized from a political movement. And it can be something that you kind of pick and choose from, like a buffet. Like, I'm going to shop at American Apparel because their sexy ads make me feel sexually liberated. And I'm going to buy Always because I like their support of young girls. And my Verizon, my like cellular plan is going to be Verizon because they care about STEM education. There is this construction of an identity through feminist or feminist branded products that, I think could go to really ridiculous places in the next few years if it keeps up. But I don't know if it will. I tend to think that as sort of a trend, it's going to fall out of favor, just as like environmentalism and AIDS activism fell out of favor among celebrities and among brands. I guess we'll see. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
More so like to you, is it the fact that, sorry, this is really long. Is it to you, is it more important that, like, who cares that they're selling the product so much as, like, the ideas out there that it's getting to people? Is that more important than the fact that, they're still using this notion to sell?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm writing this book about. I don't know if it's more important.
Hi, so I thought it was really interesting that you brought up the Always commercial, and I had a funny experience with it on Super Bowl Sunday. I was in a room of about 20 people, and I would say at least half were women. And as the commercial was playing, everyone was like, oh, this is a great commercial. All the women were into it, really excited. And then as soon as it was revealed that it was an Always commercial, there was a roar of extreme disappointment of every single woman in the room. And one woman even said, I thought it was going to be Nike. And it was just this really crazy idea. And I noticed, I was kind of watching everyone, and the reaction was really funny to me because what seemed like was a really motivational and strong commercial was a letdown to them because it was for a feminine product. And they were hoping that it was almost kind of opposite of an equal commercial because of what it was for. So I don't know. Do you have an experience where it's pretty common that for some women what they think is a win, others see as the exact opposite?
Yeah, definitely. And we were talking about this in Sarah's class earlier today. There is never going to be an across-the-board agreement about, the most feminist thing. Is this movie the most feminist? Is this book the most feminist? It shouldn't have to be a competition. But yeah, I mean, people obviously are going to bring their own sense of what's most important to the, sort of aspects of this feminist marketing. Or the celebrities who claim to be a feminist, and then someone finds some reason why they shouldn't be considered a feminist and, tries to like get them in a blog post or something like that. There's always going to be this sense of like, we don't necessarily believe that this is all good, and here's why. We're always going to find reasons to find fault with something like that. Yeah, I don't know. That's sort of, we have to wrap up.
No, we're good. But I wanted to just follow up on this because I think that that's a really, really interesting reaction. Like that, like one corporate brand would be somehow seen as more empowering. And this Always ad, the one they showed on the Super Bowl, is a very short version of a longer ad that I have to, admit, full disclosure, this is what I do in my scholarship is I look at ads and I study gender and media, and every time I watch that ad, I start to cry. I mean, it is like so emotive and so like, oh my God, she's running like a girl. I mean, it's just, every single time. So I think they did a really good job with the rhetoric of it. But that it's Nike, that it's a feminine hygiene product, that somehow that then is supposed to be less than Nike. I mean, it seems to me that the ridiculous feminine hygiene products are the ones where, women are wearing like all white and going, I have my period, it's so empowering, and like running through or swimming or playing. This one is like actually, taking something that is about being a woman and saying, this is also about being a woman. People think they call you a girl and it's an insult. And so I actually thought, in that sense, it's a little bit more complicated than Nike's like run like a play like a girl campaign, which is also an interesting campaign, but it's about sports and it's about strength and it's about only those women who can attain that sort of body, whereas Always is about most women. So anyway.
I find like yogurt commercials much more demeaning because, you know, yogurt is not gendered. I mean, maxi pads and tampons are inherently gendered. The fact that yogurt is sold as though it's this female specific product that women just have, you know, just love eating. Like, that's far weirder to me as kind of like an empowerment project than always is. But I do understand. I think that reaction is really based on this idea that, like, however we spin these things, there's a certain way in which femininity and just being a woman in general is devalued by culture, even though there's this artificial sort of heightening of it through advertising. It's almost like advertising is trying to make up for the ways in which women are devalued elsewhere in society by being like, yay, you're a woman. Use our maxi pads.
Okay.
I was wondering, with the whole new he for she movement that Emma Watson was talking about, is that the new way to try to get men into feminism? Because I feel like the conversation about feminism has been, up until now, I mean, I'm pretty young, so I don't really know, but up until now, it's been more focused on like women empowerment and kind of blocking out the men in terms of having them also be for female empowerment. And I feel like it's now just starting to push the conversation towards like, oh, men, you're also welcome to be feminists. And so I'm wondering if the he for she movement is really going to be what pushes it more towards including the men. Because like, as I was kind of looking around the room, like, this is mostly women. And I feel like whenever feminism comes up as a topic, men just kind of blank out, or you have the opposite reaction of the meninists who like fight against feminism, which just like enrages me. But I'm wondering if the he for she movement is going to be a different step forward that's actually going to take it to another level, because men have been kind of inadvertently or consciously like excluded from the conversation thus far in terms of being in support for feminism.
Right. Well, they haven't been excluded, not at all. I mean, there's certainly a lot of, there are a lot of very respected, male authors on feminism, like Michael Kimmel, and Soot Jali does a lot of filmmaking around, representation of women and men in advertising. There's definitely been a very rich presence of male feminists who, are not necessarily considered outliers or exceptions. So I don't necessarily think that's new, or that he for she is breaking any new ground there. In fact, that's kind of one of my issues with it, is that it's something that actual feminists, sorry, Emma Watson, let me backpedal. It's something that feminists have been saying for decades now, and something that feminists, both male and female, have been writing about. There is no women's liberation without men's liberation. It's all connected. But, you get a cute, hot young actress saying it, and all of a sudden people are like, it's like the greatest thing since sliced bread. That's sort of my issue with it, is that it's really just a different packaging on an old concept. That said, if it does make people rethink the idea of feminism as a zero-sum game, that's great. I've seen no evidence so far that it's actually doing that. But, the fact that it's getting a lot of press could help, certainly.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for being here. I've been reading Bitch for 10 years, and I love it. I know that on your website you guys use content warnings, or also known as trigger warnings, and I wondered how you made the decision about when and how to use them, where to place them. I've gotten requests to trigger warn things like if I'm going to write about bugs or vomit, just these things that I'm like, oh God, I will never stop writing trigger warnings if this is what I do. I wondered how you made that decision.
That's actually a good question. I don't remember how it came about with the web, because I haven't been involved in, I stepped back from my editor-in-chief role several years ago, so I haven't been that involved in terms of the nuts and bolts of that stuff. But the first time we really talked about it was when, about 7 years ago, when we had like a comics insert in one of the hard copy, one of the print issues, there was one comic that people sort of retroactively wanted to have been warned about. And, we really talked about the idea of whether it's possible for a print magazine to be a safe space and what it would mean to have content warnings. It really would necessitate making the cover a content warning, just because there's such a range of stuff that is considered triggering that we also feel is really important to talk about without that kind of stricture on it. We talked about the print magazine and the web and the website as separate entities, and the website being the place for content warnings. And I think it was when we started having guest bloggers, and a lot of them would have like a beat. There was one person who would write about like race and pop music. Another person was writing about reproductive rights and justice. And that was the point at which we realized that content warnings could be useful, because we had a lot of readers who were following these blogs and were reading them every day for new content. And we did sort of realize that it was important that we really tried to think of the website in particular as a community of readers who were investing in the work that we were doing, and we wanted to really be mindful of the things they cared about, and content warnings were one of those things.
Okay, since we did have this comment about men in the class in the group, I want to finish up with one question from a guy, since we haven't had, there hasn't been a male voice here yet. So.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. My name's Justin. So as you said, media is inescapable, and youth are the most impressionable when it comes to the effects of this. I have a 6-year-old son, so I'm already noticing this. And I believe that media literacy, as you said, something I just recently came to knowledge of, thanks to Stacey Smith, I believe it's an important tool in helping, the youth, the people who are impressionable, fight or combat the misrepresentation of a lot of gender roles, and, just people in general. What do you think is important for educating our youth, whether it be boys or girls, when it comes to feminism, especially when pop culture and media is so predominant in their lives? It was like
Right.
10 hours and 45 minutes a week,
Yeah, I have a 6-year-old son as well, and so this comes up a lot because, occasionally you don't necessarily know where they come up with some of the beliefs that they come up with. My son came home one day and was like, I don't even know how it came up, but it was like, girls don't skateboard. And my husband, who used to be a professional skateboarder, was like, we're going to deal with this right now. And, called up all these YouTube videos of girls skateboarding. And then every time they go to the skate park is really careful to point out, oh, look at the girls. Remember when you said you didn't think they skateboarded? And I think just pointing out what's there, what's missing, and what is sort of appropriate to talk about. I will often hear, mothers talk about like, well, how can I get my daughter to stop caring about princesses? And it's like, that's not the point. Like, you don't want to tell them princesses are bad, because they're just going to want them more. But you have to widen the definition of what a princess is. Like, show them Star Wars if they're old enough. Princess Leia's a princess, find more diverse princesses and point out the different ways that they're doing princessing, because it obviously, I know what they're saying when they talk about not wanting 24/7 princesses, but I think there's also a way to not shut down the imagination and the possible conversations by putting things off limits. So yeah, it really is just about asking questions. Like, if you're watching a movie with a younger person, really being careful to point out, like, isn't it interesting that the mommy's the only one, you know, in the kitchen? Or why do you think that the girls are being excluded from this game of baseball? And talking about that stuff. I mean, I don't mean like laying a lot of feminist theory on 6-year-olds, but just talking in their language about what seems, you know, what seems off. Yeah.
I think I laid a lot of feminist theory on my 6-year-old son when he was 6. He was like, now he's 22, and he's just like, but I remember Ariel, it was the Little Mermaid, and he's like, I would start to say something because it was one of those things where he would watch it over and over again, and he's like, I know. No one looks like that in real life. I know. You know, so, but I also will just to you know, finish up there, I was just reading about something about what it means to be an ally. And I think that your question is also about how do you talk to your kid and how do you create a context in your household for the people who live there to be allies in justice movements, to be allies in things like feminism, but also, you know, this was about someone saying to to a panel of African American feminists about Ferguson and about Staten Island and about the incredible, horrific violence against black men by police that we've saw this, you know, kind of a remarkable uptick in the last year, and it was, you know, saying, look, how do I be your ally? And this woman said, you know how you can be my ally, our ally? Talk to your kids about this. Tell them what that was about. Tell them that is about how race sometimes works. Tell them that they don't have to, you know, Bill de Blasio got in so much trouble in New York for saying that, you know, telling his kid that he needs to, you know, be prepared for something different than a white boy, right? Tell your white kids that you don't have to be prepared, and this is why. This is how, you know, this is how structural racism works. So I just think that teaching people to be allies is a really important way that is not about speaking on behalf of anyone or for anyone or, you know, being a blowhard about any of this, but just like this is what it means to be an ally in these movements. Anyway, there is wine and beer and little bites of food up in the forum. Please help join me in thanking Andi for a great
coming.